Hollywood's golden age was built on beautiful faces, brilliant performances, and carefully manufactured illusions. The studios sold audiences a fantasy where their stars seemed almost perfect, glamorous, confident, untouchable. But behind the velvet curtains were performers whose personal decisions could be shockingly reckless, impulsive, or simply disastrous. Some had enormous talent but repeatedly sabotaged their own careers. Others trusted the wrong people, burned bridges, ignored warnings, or turned their private lives into public scandals. And sometimes, the biggest danger to a Hollywood star wasn't the studio, the critics, or the competition. It was the star himself. Tonight, we're looking back at 5 golden age actors whose questionable judgment became almost as famous as their performances. These are stories of wasted opportunities, wild behavior, broken relationships, and decisions that left Hollywood shaking its head. And the first story begins with a man whose extraordinary talent was constantly fighting against his own reckless nature. John Barrymore had one of the greatest acting talents Hollywood ever produced, but his personal life often seemed determined to destroy everything his talent built. Born into the famous Barrymore theatrical family, he became a respected stage actor before conquering Hollywood. Audiences admired his voice, intelligence, charm, and extraordinary screen presence. But Barrymore also developed a reputation for heavy drinking, extravagant behavior, and impulsive decisions. Behind the cameras, the truth was darker. His marriages repeatedly collapsed, his finances became increasingly unstable, and alcohol increasingly controlled his life. What made his story so painful was that Barrymore understood exactly what he was losing. Friends and colleagues often saw flashes of the brilliant performer he could still be, only to watch him disappear back into destructive habits. His career gradually became less about the magnificent actor he once was and more about the tragedy unfolding around him. By the later years of his life, his health and finances had deteriorated badly, and his legendary reputation could no longer protect him from reality. Fans remembered the handsome young star, but the man they eventually saw was a heartbreaking shadow of that figure. And if Barrymore's downfall showed what addiction could do to a brilliant actor, the next story reveals something even more dangerous, a star who repeatedly treated Hollywood like a game he could never lose. Errol Flynn lived as if consequences were something that happened to other people. With his striking looks, effortless charm, and adventurous image, Flynn became one of Hollywood's biggest male stars during the 1930s and 1940s. His performances in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood turned him into the ultimate screen swashbuckler. But his real life became almost as wild as the characters he played. Flynn drank heavily, pursued an extravagant lifestyle, and became notorious for sexual scandals and reckless behavior. His famous trial in 1943, involving allegations of statutory rape, became a national sensation. He was acquitted, but the scandal permanently changed the way the public viewed him. Instead of learning to step carefully around controversy, Flynn continued living dangerously. He surrounded himself with parties, alcohol, women, and increasingly destructive habits. What happened next shocked Hollywood. The man whose career depended on youthful energy began aging rapidly under the pressure of his lifestyle. Yet even then, Flynn seemed unable, or unwilling, to slow down. His own autobiography helped cement the outrageous image he had created. There was a strange tragedy beneath the glamour. Flynn had everything Hollywood could offer, but he often behaved as though none of it could ever disappear. Eventually, it did. And the next star's story is even more unsettling, because his reckless behavior became inseparable from one of Hollywood's most disturbing mysteries. Mickey Rooney became a superstar while he was still a child, and that may have been part of the problem. By the time most people were learning how to handle adulthood, Rooney had already spent years surrounded by studio executives, managers, reporters, and enormous amounts of money. He became one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, but his personal life was famously chaotic. Rooney married 8 times, and his relationships repeatedly became public dramas. His financial situation was equally turbulent. Despite earning huge sums during his career, Rooney eventually faced serious financial difficulties and later spoke openly about the money he had lost and the people who had taken advantage of him. But behind the headlines was something more complicated than simply being foolish. Rooney had entered show business as a child and spent much of his life trusting people around him. That made him vulnerable in an industry where everyone seemed to want something. His enormous talent never disappeared, but his judgment often seemed to lag far behind his fame. Fans saw the energetic star of Andy Hardy and the brilliant entertainer who could sing, dance, act, and perform almost anything. They didn't always see the man struggling to control the life that fame had created for him. And Rooney's story was only the first warning that Hollywood success and good judgment were very different things. Frances Farmer's story is one of the most tragic examples of how Hollywood can confuse independence with instability. Farmer was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to become more than just another pretty face. She had attended the University of Washington and became known for her writing and strong opinions before Hollywood turned her into a star. But that independence came at a cost. Farmer disliked the restrictions placed on performers and resisted the polished image studios expected her to maintain. Her clashes with Hollywood authorities, struggles with alcohol, and conflicts in her personal life eventually contributed to a devastating breakdown. In 1942, she was arrested for reckless driving and disorderly conduct, and her life became increasingly chaotic. She was eventually institutionalized, and stories later emerged describing horrific treatment and abuse. Some of the most sensational claims about her institutionalization were exaggerated or disputed, but there is no doubt that Farmer experienced severe mistreatment and spent years struggling with forces she could not control. Calling her simply dumb would completely miss the tragedy. Farmer's real weakness may have been that she underestimated how powerful the system around her was. She believed she could fight Hollywood on her own terms. Instead, the system fought back with a force that destroyed much of her career and personal life. Her story reminds us that sometimes what looks like foolishness from the outside is actually a desperate struggle against circumstances no one else can see. George Raft had the looks, the style, and the connections to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars. But his career became a remarkable example of how bad decisions can haunt a performer for decades. Raft was closely associated with gangster roles and cultivated an image that made him seem dangerous even when he wasn't acting. His problem wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was that his loyalty, pride, and personal judgment sometimes pushed him toward decisions that were disastrous for his career. Raft famously turned down opportunities connected to films that later became classics, including roles associated with movies such as High Sierra and The Maltese Falcon. He reportedly feared being typecast or preferred other opportunities at the time. Those decisions became part of Hollywood legend because the roles he rejected helped make other actors enormous stars. Imagine watching Humphrey Bogart become iconic in a role you could have played. That was Raft's nightmare. His career continued, but the momentum never fully returned. He also maintained friendships and associations that reinforced his tough guy image long after audiences had started moving toward different kinds of stars. The tragedy was that Raft had everything Hollywood wanted: charisma, screen presence, confidence, and a distinctive look. But confidence can become stubbornness, and stubbornness can become self-sabotage. By the time Raft realized how many opportunities had slipped away, Hollywood had already moved on. And the next star's mistakes would become even more heartbreaking. The golden age of Hollywood was built on illusion. We remember the tuxedos, the movie palaces, the glamorous premieres, and the stars who seemed almost superhuman. But behind those images were ordinary people making extraordinary mistakes. Some were reckless. Some were naive. Some were trapped by childhood fame, addiction, bad relationships, impossible studio expectations, or simply their own personalities. And that's what makes these stories so fascinating. The stars we remember as perfect were never perfect at all. Their mistakes, their scandals, and their tragedies were part of the real history hiding behind the silver screen. Because when the lights went down and the cameras stopped rolling, Hollywood's greatest illusion disappeared. What remained were human beings trying, and sometimes failing, to survive their own fame. If you enjoy uncovering the darker side of classic Hollywood, subscribe for more stories from the Golden Age.